Hello everyone, my name is Raimund Bleischwitz. I'm Professor on Sustainable Global Resources at University College London, and I'm Director of the Bartlett School on Environment, Energy and Resources. So the talk I would like to give is about the world we are in. We live in a world that is seamlessly interconnected, isn't it? Really? So my talk is about the resource nexus and the way of how a nexus thinking, the assessment of interlinkages of using natural resources is useful in understanding the world we are in, useful in assessing the resource interlinkages, and also helpful in enabling us to look ahead, to pursue strategies of how resources can be used in a much more sustainable manner. So bear with me for just a second while I'm uploading my slides and start the presentation. It is about the resource nexus, a risk radar in an uncertain world. The world around us right now is characterized through the massive shockwave of the COVID-19 emergency. We are all in a shutdown situation, isn't it? So we would have wished to meet in person, but actually we can't. There is a potential recession ahead of us. However, we are also witnessing the largest ever annual fall of CO2 emissions in China, in European countries, in most countries worldwide, while at the same time, the climate emergency situation continues. And there is a strong need for a Green Deal and for much more integrative approaches that help us to combine the responses to COVID-19, the responses to climate emergency, and enable us to overcome the fragmentation. So is this resource nexus really an integrating approach? I would say yes. Come with me. The resource nexus has been introduced almost 10 years ago in a conference in Bonn and a couple of conferences and papers to look across the silos of energy, water, and food to address the interlinkages. And the statement is that it would enable us to overcome such silo thinking. I myself, I was a fellow at the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, DC back then, 2011, 2012. And our joint work then accumulated into what you see here on the slide as a handbook of the resource nexus, with more than 100 authors coming from more than 50 institutions and writing more than 30 chapters about how we can conceptualize the resource nexus. We define it as a set of context-specific critical interlinkages between two or more natural resources used as inputs in socio-economic systems. As such, it is at the interface of science, planning, and policy making. It addresses directly a variety of actors, so infrastructure planning, units for water and energy, the food industry and the entire supply chain of it, development agencies, international organizations, and all of those organizations are quite often operating in crisis regions and or in the global south. So it is very much a concept that was born out of development thinking and indeed out of the acknowledgement that so often development has failed to meet the needs of the current generation and at the same time to address basic environmental issues of using those resources. What is happening? The idea is that we have those, call it systems of provision on water, on energy, on food basically, but we also suggest to include land as an ultimate provisional factor and materials that serve our needs for shelter, for housing, and a couple of others. What you see here represented is that a number of those interlinkages exist. We evidently need water to produce energy, for instance, cooling in power station, but we also need energy to provide water and distribute it to the customers. And it's the same with water and food, evidently. We need a couple of minerals to produce useful forms of energy and the like. So those interlinkages can be assessed, they can be quantified, they can be monitored, there can be different forms of assessment about which I'll talk in a second. But the point to make here is that indeed it is also very much related to the sustainable development goals that are predominantly about one of those systems of provision. We look at hunger, we look at water, we look at energy, for instance, but also at the interlinkages. So the question therefore is, would a Nexus approach help us to integrate across the SDGs? I would say definitely yes. So if we just had this thought experiment about pursuing single goals in isolation, like the goal number 2 to end hunger and achieve food security, that evidently increases the demand for land, for mineral fertilizers, for water, for biomass itself, and for food. So there would be the risk of using more of other resources if we wanted to achieve that particular goal. And it is similar with regard to energy, with regard to water, with regard to urban development, sustainable cities, resilient infrastructures, all of which come with increasing demand for materials, increasing demand for water when it comes to like increasing the provision of energy. And indeed, that is something that is addressed in the SDGs itself. We could think in particular of the SDG number 12, which is on the sustainable management and efficient use of all resources. But the point to make here is that a nexus enables us to look at the interlinkages across the SDGs and strengthens, in particular, SDG number 12 on the sustainable consumption and production of natural resources and the more efficient use. So that's important to understand. And I mentioned the low carbon economy at the beginning. It is also here quite relevant to understand that it is not just about energy system, which is interesting in itself, whole energy systems, to understand where the energy comes from and the energy that is needed to provide useful form of energy. But the point here from a Nexus perspective is that you need also more material and water for a low carbon energy. Renewable energies need steel for like wind energy turbine, for instance. There's also rare earth metals that are needed for a number of applications. A hydrogen economy that many people talk about needs more zinc, more platinum. Hydroelectricity is also a case in point. Geothermal energy, concentrated solar power, bioethanol are very much water intensive. All infrastructures for distribution, they need steel, they need copper, they need nickel. They also need cement and concrete to fix it in the ground. Sustainable buildings require stronger, more flexible and lighter materials. There's also a demand for lightweight steel, for composites, for aluminium, carbon fibers in sustainable transport. There is the huge discussion about electric vehicles that need lithium, that need cobalt, and again, rare earth elements. So that is something that needs to be considered when the Paris Agreement is to be implemented, and indeed the SDG on climate needs to be met. But by the way, this is not a pledge to move away from those commitments, because also unconventional fuels and carbon capture storage need much materials and water. And indeed, the conventional, the fossil fuel industry is not just causing all the climate change, but it is also very much water and land intensive and energy intensive and material intensive. So there's no point to look back, but to look forward and then indeed pursue the agenda of a low carbon economy with the help of Nexus thinking. Would it actually help if we looked alternatively at a circular economy? That is a very interesting debate, because the circular economy is a holistic concept, kind of a vision how we can move away from a linear economy to an economy that keeps materials in circles, maintains utility, and produces public value. So you would think that indeed circular economy thinking does contribute to reaching and connecting the SDGs. But actually, when you look at it, you also see here in the paper that Patrick Schroeder and others have published 2 years ago, is that it is very much an indirect contribution. A progress in a circular economy will also support reaching the sustainable development goals. So the practical question then again is, how do we look, how do we measure a circular economy? What are actually the resources that are part of a circular economy? And how would those resource interlinkages be taken into account? And indeed, the measurement is out there. We are not yet quite circular. They estimate that people from Austria have done Meyer et al. Come to the conclusion that we are just 6% circular, which is pretty low, and there's a lot that needs to be done. It is measured in material flow accounting methodology that in itself is progress, but it looks at materials in a very aggregated manner. There are little interlinkages in the concept itself, in looking across the materials into biotic resources and energy more specifically. There's no account in it for water and for land. So there's something that needs to be added in order to understand how circular we are and to indeed become more circular. And that is, again, a point where the nexus thinking might be useful. I would also think that a nexus approach is useful not just for the sort of primary sector where we start developing the systems of provision and produce energy, produce water, but also for the entire system to the end user. We did some analysis on the water energy nexus in Brazil, where indeed we all have been witnessing the terrible drought in the last years that has created water insecurity issues and also energy insecurity. So what we have done, and that's been a colleague of mine, Theo Zamatsidis, he applied the nexus thinking through a water budget approach to assess hydroelectricity and the evaporation around each individual hydro dam in Brazil. So that then comes to the conclusion that in particular in the Northeast, there is a water insecure situation in the future, increasing due to climate change. And indeed, the data has been put into it. So there's definitely a need to be more resilient and aware of critical water shortages in the Northeast. And you may say that is not a surprise in itself, but we did the data analysis and compared with the rest of Brazil. It suggests that there should be much more interconnected grids between the regions and also a solar-based renewable energy system in the other parts of Brazil, while indeed in the north, you would need to have a renewable energy part that is more water resistant. That is a result that is indeed written down, and it is fueling the narrative that you can apply to the systems of provision, in that you understand better how the more decentral water system in Brazil can be aligned with a more centrally organized energy system, which is at the heart of another piece of research that we did. That's Priscilla Carvalho, who worked at the institutional deficits in integrated planning and participatory approaches in Brazil. And she came to the conclusion that indeed we need principles, legal principles, normative legal principles that would help to overcome the silo thinking and then balance in case of conflicts of interest and make sure that the end users, that the urban population, the rural population deserve the water they need, and they should not necessarily be a priority for providing water for, say, industry rather than the people. So principles will then say, put the people first, isn't it? So that is one of the issues that is very much a discussion within the Nexus community about livelihoods. There are people like Jeremy Alouche saying, it is a bit technocratic, is it? I would say there is potential to improve, and it has been Eloise Bix and a couple of others who really have put the livelihood in a Nexus approach at the forefront to address the fragility of communities, the vulnerability of some neighborhoods, and then indeed bring the thinking of what is the water need, what is the energy need, what is the bottom line into those participatory planning approaches. I would also think, if you follow me, that the Nexus is very much a multi-scale type of approach, and that contrasts, I would say, interestingly, with planetary boundaries, global governance, top-down sort of approaches where we have a global common good. Here, with the Nexus and the systems of provision, we have inherently a much stronger regional scale, a regional scope, but it is also very much interlinked with the local level and indeed with transboundary or the global level. When we look, for instance, at the case study that Bassel Daher and a couple of others have done on northwestern Kenya, the climate security resource nexus there, we see that this is very much a dryland characterized region with pastoralism, with wildlife conservation. There's an interesting ownership model called group ranch, communal ownership with a long tradition of inter-ethnic violent conflicts, which is driven by scarcities over access to resources. And it is nowadays exacerbated by access to small arms, climate change as a stress multiplier, and discoveries of oil and underground water that brings in the big players. So that is a situation that is very dangerous, that has a potential to escalate. And you would think it is here where understanding those competing demands over access to resources, be it from traditional actors or from newly emerging actors, including oil and other industries, helps understanding what all this is about. As a risk radar, as I said at the beginning, this is indispensable and very useful to pursue. There also has been an interesting analysis done by Chrissy Laspidou and a couple of others about the Nexus in Greece. What I very much like about it is the visualization tools they have developed. So they look at the energy water nexus, in particular in Greece, but also the nexus with food, with a built environment, natural land, as we said, and greenhouse gas emission. And what they are figuring out, and you realize that indeed Sankey diagrams are just a very useful tool to use. Then indeed you can analyze the sort of sectorial interlinkages, and what they have done is that they have put it into a system dynamic modeling approach that helps us understanding some analysis of what has been happening, how one driver results in using other resources, and what could happen in the future. So a very interesting approach that, again, makes the point that we can have a regional scale while at the same time also integrating other scales into the nexus thinking. Which leads us to the question whether we can also apply it in international relations. Evidently we can, in particular when we look at transboundary river management. What we did a while ago is to also look at conflict minerals, where indeed the coltan story, the coltan story is known for being used in mobile phones and other IT equipment while being sourced in a civil war region in the eastern part of Democratic Republic of Congo. It's been going on for quite many years now, at least since 2005-06, as a dominant source on the world market, while indeed the civil war has been going on for much, much longer. The nexus story here is that this is a region which is characterized by civil war, but also by small-scale artisanal mining. So applying a nexus helps us to understand the land use conflicts, some of the motifs that the regional actors have, the poor miners that have entire families, including their children, in the mining area because they could earn $5 a day instead of less than one if they did farming. So there's a devastating effect, a knock-on effect on land use, agriculture, while at the same time, indeed, there is this international trade and the supply chain that goes to the facilities in China and other countries where then the mobile phones and others are assembled. So that very much helps us to bring transparency into the tools of sustainable resource management, but also then to look more deeply into what happens on the ground and not just start with the first credible supplier on the ground, which might be a local trader, but really go upstream and look at what happens on the ground. A similar analysis has been done by my Chinese colleague Tian Zhu from the Shanghai's Jiao Tong University. She is doing great footprint analysis, and she looked with a nexus lens and via input-output tables at the dominant resource dimensions, energy, materials, and land, and the share that the BRICS countries have in providing those materials. And again, you see Sankey diagrams applied. You will probably not be surprised to see a very strong share of South Africa and the coal production there and providing energy, followed indeed by Russia. But also then indeed in materials, you see the strong role of Russia. Think of, say, platinum and some other materials. And when it comes to land, India is the strongest supplier to strong agriculture they have. And all these diagrams have data and analysis on who is providing what to whom, and also then to look at it in a comparison. So again, very useful analysis on those international relations, international trade and the like. Now, could a nexus enable us to look ahead? Much of the analysis that we have seen so far in research and in practical organizations comes with time series, comes with comparisons across resources, across countries and regions. It is very much zooming in into particular regions, helping us to understand. So as a risk radar, the nexus is very much established. One typically uses a number of methods, data-driven, assessment-driven, to understand the situation. The move forward is something that is, I would say, still a bit ahead of us, which is indeed what is needed when we look at low carbon economy requirements to implement the SDGs, etc. So again, Basel Daher and a couple of others have been innovative in starting with some foresight analysis based on questions around energy use, water use, food demand in regions, and then they develop an iterative approach through those questions. They called it filters, to then develop narratives of how a better food supply, a better organization of the food system can be developed in the relation with energy, with water, with others, for like a municipal government. What we have done is to look at different forms of scenarios. And I would like to go with you quickly through the slide here, that one of the scenarios that we need to think through is more like a shock type of scenario, isn't it? We are used to develop business as usual. We are less good in really looking at the estimated negative impacts of climate change, at some of the repercussions that could come through stress multiplier. What happens if food and water stress come together in a region? What happens if this is a region that is considered essential for the supply of energy or minerals for the rest of the world, what happens on the ground, and what happens for like world economy. So that is where we have to come to grips with potential shock scenarios, where actually there could be a supply shortage, where then indeed there might be others stepping in, but understanding that there might be non-linear shocks, like right now with COVID-19. This can be contrasted with a second type of scenario, which are called mission-oriented scenarios, which are very much driven by an idea. And we could think here of circular economy, low carbon economy. We would then indeed have this idea of a much brighter future. We could, by the way, also develop new business as usual scenarios, which are driven by slightly different trends. So actually, we could have both more optimistic business as usual scenarios, more counterintuitive business as usual scenarios, but also these very ambitious mission-oriented scenarios. These type of scenarios then would help us to develop strategies where we would have scenarios with milestones about annual increases of resource efficiency, acceleration of newly designed products and services through a circular economy, and then develop the roadmaps that are needed to get there. And from time to time, indeed, we need review type of assessments, where again, the scenarios then can be revised. And here's a proposal. We could develop together roadmaps on transformative pathways for key industries like cement, like steel, like automotive, and work on how a future there could look like with a new mission here. We did a case, so we have published a paper on the shift to scrap steel. We modeled the higher recycling rate, 50%, 100% actually, of the Chinese steel coming from scrap. So secondary steel will be the main source of supply, and then the impact on the world economy would be actually positive, because there would be more supply of steel, and the developing countries would benefit in their development needs. And if that steel is produced in a sustainable manner, indeed including potentially the energy and the electricity for the scrap steel, then indeed we would have a positive economic and environmental outcome. And we did it with the help of a macroeconomic model, CGE type, called UCL Engage. And my colleague Victor Nechifor was the leading author on this one. So again, this is just an illustration, but the point to make here is that we need more scenarios, and the 4 scenario types that I just shared with you here are hopefully a good starting point for what can and should be developed in the future. So here's my outlook. Where are we with the Nexus, and what could be perspectives for Nexus research and activities? I would say yes, Nexus research has been growing considerably. There are so many interesting, super interesting papers about case studies, about revisions of tools, about planning, and it can therefore be said that it has become relevant as a trend analysis, as a risk radar for resource interlinkages across time and across scales. It also addresses both technology development, energy, water, and others, and human security issues. It could be better, absolutely agreed, but the interface between science and policy and interstate security and human security is there. And the papers, the evidence is good that the Nexus approach is useful here. Is it convincing, a compelling story? I had a short discussion with Vabi Mota, who said, well, he's one of the pioneers. He said, Raimund, we are not yet quite there, and he's right. So there is much more that needs to be done to unleash and help actors really adopting at a large scale the Nexus thinking. So those sort of applied nexus analysis would need to be strengthened. We would need to think through what organizational mechanisms could actually enable us to move forward here. At the same time, being researcher myself, I would also think that there is a frontier in addressing the support function of ecosystems, groundwater, soil, all the mechanisms that help us understanding the role of land, for instance, and to understand more about the criticalities of interlinkages. How is it linked with planetary boundaries, maximum sustainable yield? So there's a lot that we can learn through linking ecosystem services, natural capital type of approaches with the nexus thinking, with the advantage of nexus going much deeper into the systems of provision at the interface of nature and the supply chain that are needed for ultimately human needs. So is it ready for takeoff? In a way, 10 years have been documenting the usefulness of the Resource Nexus research. You could probably characterize it as a growing niche, as a concept that scratches on the surfaces of many organizations' mainstream. Yet, I would also offer the perspective of looking at the Nexus research as it is, to improve it, but also to then reach out to, in particular, circular economy research, which is very much a vision, looking for assessment tools and risk radars, and then potentially have a twinning system of Nexus and the circular economy research, and indeed the policies in it. Together, this can then become really interesting in the foresight analysis, where we could have both the vision and the risk radar together, Nexus and circular economy thinking applied in a new generation of foresight analysis, of scenario analysis, and indeed also governance type of research. And with this, I'm almost done. I also have some references to share. I would like to wholeheartedly thanking you for being with us. I'm there. I look forward to discussions, to reaching out with you. There has been my email address on the screen. There's also a Twitter address. We will also, by the way, do an online hackathon in a couple of weeks. So I will be able to share the Bartlett hacks with you in just a minute. And with this, I'm ending here, and I look forward to the many discussions I hope we have.